He barked once, just once, and the judge froze mid-sentence. Because that bark, given at the exact moment a little girl tapped her chest twice, was her testimony. This isn't just a story about a trial, or a broken home, or even a child who hadn't spoken in 2 years. This is the story of a dog who spoke for her, when no one else could. A German shepherd trained for service, but destined for something far greater. To be the bridge between silence and truth. What happens when the only one brave enough to reveal the real story has 4 legs? Stay with this video and let it unfold moment by moment. It's more than a case, it's a quiet revolution, led by loyalty, memory, and love without language. If this story finds a place in your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment with what moved you most and subscribe for more true stories where even the quietest voices are finally heard. The hallway smelled of ammonia and old chalkboards, a scent Amara had come to associate with every place grown-ups called safe. Her sneakers, scuffed and a size too big, made no sound as she padded across the polished linoleum of the psychologist's office. Her small hand gripped the frayed leash of a black and tan German shepherd walking dutifully by her side. Zion. His presence was her only anchor in the otherwise hollow spaces of the world she now inhabited. No one could explain exactly why, but ever since that night, Amara hadn't spoken a single word. Not to her mother, not to her teachers, not to the rows of professionals who tried to coax her voice back with colorful puppets and pastel worksheets. But Zion didn't need words. He just knew. 8 years old, skin the color of roasted chestnuts, eyes far older than they should be. Amara had once been a bright, animated girl who hummed Disney tunes and told stories with her hands flailing in the air. But trauma has a way of rearranging childhood. One moment, her world was pink backpacks and cereal commercials. The next, it was hospital lights, whispered questions, and a courtroom date she didn't fully understand. On the surface, Zion was labeled a therapy dog, but that title didn't come close. He was something else entirely. A bridge, a guardian, a vessel holding the last fragile strands of Amara's trust in the world. He wasn't her first dog, but he was the only one who'd ever stood between her and the dark. She had met Zion 6 months ago in a beige room that smelled like lemon disinfectant. The social worker had brought him in as a last try, after 3 other animals failed to make a connection. Zion had limped slightly, an old injury from his days as a canine rescue dog, and Amara had noticed the scar on his left shoulder before anyone introduced him. She reached out, not to pet, but to press her forehead against his. He didn't move, didn't even blink. He just sat there and let her. From that moment, something shifted. No words, just knowing. Now, as they sat in the waiting area outside the family court, her small frame curled against his side, her fingers played with the soft tuft of fur beneath his collar. Her mother paced across the hallway, biting her nail and whispering to the lawyer. They had argued the night before. Her mother had been reluctant to let Zion accompany them. They'll say it's manipulation, she'd warned. But Amara had looked up with her quiet stare and tapped twice against her chest. Zion had barked once. That was all it took. The courtroom itself was a place of strange energy, solemn and fluorescent. As the bailiff opened the heavy oak doors, the judge, a tall black woman with silver-rimmed glasses and tired eyes, glanced at Amara over the edge of her bench. Her nameplate read, Judge Holloway. Her presence radiated something cold but not cruel. She motioned for Amara to be seated. Zion was directed to remain outside the barrier. His vest reading, Service Dog. Amara sat at the witness stand like a ghost child, legs swinging, hands wrapped tightly around a worn stuffed rabbit. Her dress was lemon yellow with a tiny sewn-in tear at the hem. It had once been her favorite, but like everything else, it now carried memory like static. No one spoke at first. Even the reporters in the back stopped scribbling. Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly. Amara, she said, voice deliberate, you don't have to speak if you're not ready. You can use your hands, or nod, or just look. Amara said nothing. She didn't look at the judge, didn't look at her mother. She looked only at Zion, just beyond the wood rail. He was sitting still, watching her, unblinking, waiting. There were layers to her silence. One was the memory of pain. Another, the fear of not being believed. But the deepest one was the truth that when she had spoken once before, no one had listened. Her father had apologized in court, smiled on cue. His lawyer used words like stress and a one-time mistake, but Zion remembered, and that was enough. She raised her hand slowly, a movement so subtle, so small it could have been a child swatting a fly, but her pinky traced a small, deliberate circle in the air. Zion's ears perked. He stood. A faint stir passed through the courtroom like static. The judge looked at the psychologist seated near the back, brows drawn. Is this? The judge's gaze returned to the girl. Then let's allow it. She waved a hand. The bailiff moved to open the gate. Zion trotted in slowly, not to Amara but directly to the foot of the witness stand, then turned to face the court and sat. No barking, no growl, just presence. The silence now carried a different tone. Not fear, not confusion, but anticipation. The judge leaned forward, eyes scanning Amara. "Have you want to show us?" she asked. Amara didn't respond. Instead, she reached into the side pocket of her dress and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to the court psychologist, who stepped forward and placed it gently into Judge Holloway's hand. Inside was a drawing. It was made with crayon, uneven and raw. A little girl crouched in the corner of a dim room, her hands over her head. Above her stood a man with twisted brows and shadowed mouth, yelling. His hand was raised, and in the far right corner, a dog, black and brown, standing between them. Judge Holloway turned the picture over. Block letters in shaky handwriting read, "He says he loves me, but I'm only safe when he's not here." There was a sound in the room, more exhale than voice. A collective release of breath. The girl said nothing. Zion barked once, then sat quietly again. That was the moment things shifted. Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses and glanced down at the worn manila folder in front of her, its corners softened by months of hearings and motions. The courtroom lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over every surface, highlighting how impersonal justice often looked in practice. "I understand the child's need for emotional support," she said carefully, directing her gaze toward the mother's attorney. "But the dog may not cross the barrier into the witness stand. This is a courtroom, not a playroom. We cannot have distractions compromising the integrity of this proceeding." A murmur passed through the pews behind Amarai, quiet as wind in dry leaves. Her mother, seated stiffly at the plaintiff's table, bit her bottom lip until it turned white, then nodded slightly, not daring to speak. Zion remained seated just beyond the wooden rail, his posture erect, tail still, eyes never leaving Amara. He was a silhouette of patience, a sentinel forged in fire and memory, unmoved by the rules of man. Amara sat in silence, her small hands folded over her lap, fingers gently tracing circles into the soft fabric of her yellow dress. She didn't react to the judge's words, at least not in the way most adults expected. Instead, she blinked once, slow and deliberate, then looked down toward the rail, to the familiar black and tan shape waiting faithfully. Then, with a grace that seemed born from ritual rather than rebellion, she lifted her right hand. The motion was subtle, almost too subtle for the untrained eye to notice. Her pinky finger arced in a small tight loop in the air, one smooth circle, like drawing a moon only she could see. Zion stood. It was immediate, without hesitation. His body moved like a machine cued by unseen programming. He did not hesitate, did not look for permission. He simply rose, crossed the barrier with calm, determined steps, and stopped precisely at the foot of the witness stand, where he turned to face the judge as if standing to attention. The courtroom froze. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, unsure whether to intervene. Judge Holloway held up a hand, her expression unreadable. "Is that?" she began, her voice trailing into silence. The court psychologist, seated quietly near the rear of the room, stood and took a measured step forward. "Your Honor," she said softly, "that was intentional. The signal Amara just gave this is part of a communication system we've spent months developing. Zion is trained to respond only to her specific gestures, and only when she needs help expressing herself." Judge Holloway's fingers curled slowly over her gavel, not to use it, but as if the weight of it reminded her of the rule she had sworn to uphold. "She's not under oath," she said, more to herself than the room, but the psychologist gently replied, "She doesn't need to be. Amara doesn't lie. She hasn't spoken in over 2 years. What just happened, this is how she speaks. This is how she tells the truth." For a long moment, the silence in the room felt charged. Not with tension, but with something older, deeper, like the hush before a thunderclap. Zion didn't move. His gaze remained forward, not on Amara, not on her parents, but on the judge herself, as though he understood the balance of everything now rested in this moment. Amara lowered her hand and gently reached forward, fingers brushing the edge of the wooden railing. Zion lifted his head slightly and across the room, Amara's father shifted in his chair. Dressed in an ill-fitted navy suit, he sat with his legs crossed and his arms folded tightly, jaw clenched. His eyes darted toward the bailiff and then back to the judge, who now leaned slightly forward. "Tell me, Dr. Reese," she asked the psychologist, her voice measured, "what exactly did that signal mean?" Dr. Reese nodded once and said, "That particular motion, the loop with the pinky, that's Amara's way of saying she's ready, that she's willing to proceed." The judge blinked slowly. "And she needs the dog close to do that?" "Zion doesn't just comfort her," Dr. Reese replied. "He interprets. He senses things even I can't. When she's overwhelmed, when she's afraid, when she wants to speak but can't, he becomes her language." Holloway glanced back at Amara, who was now stroking the edge of Zion's ear gently, rhythmically, almost unconsciously. "Very well," she murmured, then looked to the bailiff. "Let the dog remain." No one applauded. No one moved. It wasn't a victory, it was an allowance. A crack in the wall, a thin thread of humanity showing through the cold brick of due process. Zion, for his part, responded not with noise or movement but with quiet stillness. It was the kind of stillness that demanded to be listened to. Judge Holloway turned the page in the folder before her. "We will proceed," she said, then looked back to Amara. "Whenever you're ready, young lady." Amara didn't nod. She didn't smile. She simply reached once again into the side pocket of her dress. Another envelope, the same as before, but this one was thicker. Zion shifted his weight slightly and stepped closer to the bench. His tail didn't wag. His tongue didn't hang out. He stood like a soldier who had been called to attention by memory itself. The judge glanced at the envelope now being passed forward, its edge worn from handle. This was not an impulsive gesture. This had been prepared. Zion lifted his chin, eyes on Amara, not to seek direction but to witness. Behind them, a reporter scribbled furiously, and a woman in the gallery wiped tears from her cheek. Amara's mother whispered something to her attorney, her voice barely audible, her fingers trembling over her lap. The father remained motionless, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the rage he struggled to conceal. Judge Holloway took the envelope and turned it over in her hand. Her thumb ran along the seal as if hesitant to open something sacred. Zion didn't move. The air in the room shifted, again into that electric stillness. And then Amara tapped her chest once. Twice Zion's ears rose. The bailiff took an instinctive step forward. Judge Holloway glanced up, eyes narrowing. Dr. Reese opened her mouth to answer. But just as she did, the courtroom had fallen into that familiar silence again. The kind not born of peace but of collective breath-holding. Like a room balancing on the edge of something unspeakable. Judge Holloway held the envelope between her hands, its weight far beyond the sum of paper and ink. Her gaze flicked back to Amara, who sat unmoving, her shoulders drawn slightly, and not from fear but from restraint, as if something inside her was wound tight, waiting for the right moment to release. Then, as the judge broke the seal with a soft, tearing sound, Amara moved. 2 simple motions. Her hand rose, fingers spread, then folded into a fist as she tapped twice against the left side of her chest once and again. The gesture was so gentle, so precise, it could have been mistaken for a child adjusting a dress. But to Zion, it was a call. The dog's head snapped toward her with laser focus. Then, just as quickly, he turned to face the courtroom and let out a single, sharp bark. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive. It was intentional, clear, like punctuation at the end of a thought. Afterward, he sat back down, lowering himself into a perfect seated position. His chest puffed slightly, his gaze locked forward, not at Amara, not at the judge, but directly at the man seated on the far side of the courtroom. Amara's father. The sound of the bark seemed to echo longer than it should have, the acoustics of the chamber stretching it like an accusation. Her father flinched only slightly, but enough that a few eyes caught it. He shifted in his seat, uncrossed and recrossed his legs, adjusted his tie as if the temperature had suddenly risen. Zion didn't blink. He didn't breathe heavy or wag his tail. He simply watched, stone still, like a statue carved in warning. Judge Holloway slowly closed the envelope and placed it gently beside her stack of documents, her fingers steepling under her chin as she looked toward Amara. "That signal," she said, her voice level but probing. "The one she just made, what does it mean?" She looked over her glasses toward the back where Dr. Reith, the court-appointed child psychologist, stood already moving forward. The doctor's heels clicked lightly on the floor as she approached the front, stopping just beside the bench, her face composed but pale. "Your Honor," she began, her voice low and calm. "We've developed a few very specific gestures for Amara. Each one is tied to a core emotional or procedural statement. That double tap on the chest, it means, 'I'm ready.' But it also carries another layer." She paused for a moment, eyes softening as she looked at the girl. "It means, I need to show you something." The judge didn't respond right away. She turned slightly in her chair, her hand hovering above the photograph tucked back into the envelope, then rested her gaze back on the child. "And the bark?" she asked, motioning slightly toward Zion. "What does that signify?" Dr. Reese inhaled deeply before answering. "It's not a command response trick. Zion's bark isn't prompted by Amara in the usual sense. That's the part we didn't teach. He only barks when she signals that something is urgent. When the gesture is made, he makes a decision based on her body language, breathing, micro-response." At that, Judge Holloway sat back in her chair, and for a moment, the hard edges of her judicial persona softened. Her eyes flicked toward Amara's father, who now sat stiffly, eyes narrowed, jaw grinding. The judge studied him, then her gaze shifted back to Amara, who had not moved since making the signal. Her eyes, wide and unwavering, seemed to hold the whole room in suspension. "All right," the judge finally said, voice hushed, "then we'll see." She gestured to the envelope. "Continue." The bailiff took a step forward, but paused as Amara lifted her hand again, not to signal, but to hold up a finger. "Wait." Zion stood again, unprompted, and walked to the center of the courtroom, his nails clicking against the floor in rhythmic precision. He stopped once more and turned, this time facing not the judge but the gallery. His gaze scanned the room, then returned to Amara's father. He gave a low, almost inaudible growl, not threatening but declarative, a sound that vibrated more than it echoed. Amara's father rose halfway from his seat. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, addressing no one in particular. "This whole show, this dog whisper nonsense is manipulation." Judge Holloway's gavel struck wood, not angrily but firmly. "Sit down," she said, her voice sharp, unmistakable, "or you'll be removed." He sat hard, his breath heavy. Amara blinked slowly. Then she reached into the second envelope and handed it wordlessly to Dr. Reese. The psychologist received it like a sacred object and passed it to the judge. There was no tension in the motion, only gravity. The judge opened it slowly. Inside, a series of child-drawn pictures, some old, others recent, told of progression stick figures that evolved in detail and purpose. One drawing showed a man towering over a child, hand raised, the child curled into a ball. Another depicted a cracked door and a shadow behind it. But one image, the final one, showed Amara standing beside Zion. In the background, the same large man, blurred by shaking lines, had hands raised not in violence, but in surrender. Above them, 3 words written in blocky, childlike scrawl. "He doesn't." The judge's hand trembled slightly as she set the paper down. "Dr. Reese," she said quietly, "how long has she been preparing these?" The psychologist hesitated. "Since she met Zion. He remembers her. She draws when he's near. It's how she processes. These are her memory." Amara remained still, but her shoulders had relaxed slightly. Not as though the weight was gone, but as though it had finally been named. Zion turned to look at her, and something unspoken passed between them. A transmission neither human nor dog but both. In the gallery, someone sniffled audibly. The judge exhaled and looked across the courtroom toward Amara's father again, who now stared at the floor, unmoving. "Is there any objection?" she asked, her voice clear but low. to allowing this evidence to be entered as testimony. No one answered, because no one could. Judge Holloway held the final drawing in her hand with the same care one might show a fragile artifact dug from beneath centuries of silence. The edges of the paper were slightly curled, worn from the heat of small fingers that had gripped it too tightly too long. Crayon strokes ran thick and determined across the surface, layered with the chaotic urgency of a memory too heavy to carry and too dangerous to ignore. The courtroom was quiet again, not out of procedure, but out of reference, as if everyone inside had collectively understood they were no longer spectators to a case, but witnesses to a child's truth, delivered in a language too raw for words. In the image, a room simple, rectangular, sketched with uneven lines. In the corner, a small figure crouched, her knees drawn to her chest, arms covering her head. That figure was Amara, unmistakable even in her childlike rendering. The yellow dress, the puff of curls, the way her eyes were drawn too large, too haunted. Hovering above her was a larger form, a man with thick eyebrows slashing downward, a mouth twisted open in what could only be rage. His arm was lifted, not yet striking but poised, the threat encoded in the gesture itself. Between them, bursting forward mid-motion, was Zion, his black and tan body leaping, teeth bared not in aggression but in defense, his form arching like a shield thrown instinctively. The scene was frozen, a snapshot not of violence, but of its interruption. Judge Holloway's fingers trembled slightly as she flipped the paper over. The entire room leaned with her, as though bound to the moment by invisible wire. On the back, in uneven block letters scrawled with a red crayon that had likely been pressed too hard, were 10 words that shattered whatever composure still lingered. He says he loves me, but I'm only safe when he's not near. The weight of those words didn't fall gently. They landed like iron dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that reached every corner of the courtroom. A few audible gasps slipped from the gallery. One juror placed a hand over their mouth. Even the stenographer hesitated. Their fingers paused above the keys. Zion remained in his seated position, unmoving, his gaze now fixed on the drawing in the judge's hand, as if affirming its truth simply by bearing witness to it. Dr. Reese stepped forward, her voice hushed but firm. "Your Honor," she said. "Amara drew that 2 weeks ago, during a session where she began reprocessing her trauma. We didn't prompt the content. Zion had been laying beside her the entire time. As she drew, he became more alert, more focused, the closer she got to that moment." The judge's lips parted, then closed. Her brow furrowed as she studied the final stroke of the words on the back, how the letters slanted downward as if even the sentence had run out of strength. She turned to Amara's father. "Mr. Lewis," she said, her voice low, measured, "do you deny ever physically intimidating your daughter?" He leaned forward, his voice tight and rehearsed. "The picture is nothing but imagination. Kids make things up, especially when they're being poisoned against their father." The words hung in the air like smoke from a damp fire, acrid and unconvincing. Zion's ears twitched. He rose, took 2 steps forward, and stopped directly between Amara and her father. He didn't bark this time. He simply stood. The room held its breath again. Judge Holloway did not strike her gavel. She didn't need to. Her silence was heavier than any sound. Amara, still seated, slowly reached into the 3rd envelope that had been tucked beneath her chair. She passed it forward through Dr. Reese without a word. The judge opened it cautiously, as if bracing herself for whatever truth had yet to surface. Inside was a smaller drawing more abstract than the others. Periodic swirls of red, black, and gray. In the center, a tiny yellow spot, a speck that could have been a dress or a sun or a soul, stood alone amidst the storm. Zion's form appeared again, not drawn in detail but suggested as if he was the only part of the memory too sacred to distort. There were no words on the back this time, but the image said enough. Dr. Reese glanced at the judge and added, "She drew this after waking up from a nightmare." She didn't speak, but she crawled onto the floor with Zion curled into his side and started drawing this. It's the only way she could explain what she saw. The judge's voice softened, though her hands remained rigid. "And she told you?" The moment we tried to talk, she stopped, but as long as Zion was there, she kept drawing. That's when we realized Zion doesn't just comfort her, he translates her memory into something the world can finally understand. From the gallery, someone murmured, "Lord have mercy," under their breath. Amara's mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her fingers trembling not just with sadness, but with relief, like someone seeing the clouds part after a storm too long endured. Judge Holloway looked up again, this time not at Amara or her dog, but directly at the defendant. "Mr. Lewis," she said, "this court does not take kindly to minimizing a child's trauma." He opened his mouth to respond, but she raised a finger, quiet but firm. "Don't," she said. "I've seen enough." She turned back to Amara, then to Zion, whose eyes remained locked ahead, as if awaiting the next signal. The judge placed the final drawing down on the table before her and interlaced her fingers. Her voice, when she spoke again, had lost its judicial coldness. It was almost maternal. "You've said more in one picture than most adults say in 1,000 words, she said softly. "I hear you, Amara, and I believe you." Amara didn't move, didn't smile, but her hands rested more loosely on her lap now. Zion, too, settled back onto his haunches, though his eyes never left the man across the room. Behind them, the air shifted, less a release, more a recalibration. The court was beginning to see that it was not just presiding over a custody case. It was witnessing the slow unraveling of a buried truth, pulled from the shadows not by argument, but by crayons, courage, and the constancy of a dog who remembered what she could not say. The judge glanced toward the bailiff, preparing to speak again, but just then, the echo of the judge's softened words still lingered in the room like smoke. "I hear you, Amara, and I believe you." When Zion shifted, it was so subtle that only a few noticed at first. The way his ears twitched slightly, his neck turning with the precision of a compass needle pulled by a hidden magnet. His eyes broke away from the defendant for the first time since entering the courtroom and locked onto the gallery, scanning the faces behind the wooden divider as if following a scent no human nose could detect. Then, like a string pulled taut and released, he stood, took 3 precise steps forward, planted his feet squarely, and barked once. Then again. Then a third time. Each bark was crisp, evenly spaced, not wild, not reactive, but purposeful. The sound cut through the courtroom like a blade. Heads turned, whispers erupted, and then all eyes landed on the man seated in the far right row, third seat from the aisle, wearing a pale button-down shirt and a strained expression that cracked as Zion's final bark echoed across the chamber. The man's name was Alan Drexler, social worker, court-appointed, trusted liaison between the Child Protection Services and the family court. Until this moment, his name had appeared on every report filed in Amara's case, his assessments regarded as neutral, factual, beyond question. But now his posture was rigid, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted the collar of his shirt, eyes darting like a caged animal sensing exposure. The judge narrowed her gaze. "Mr. Drexler," she said, her tone shifting back into authority, "is there something you'd like to say in response to the dog's reaction?" He cleared his throat, offered a nervous chuckle. "Your Honor, with all due respect, dogs bark. It's not a reliable metric for cross-examination." Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line, and yet, this dog only barks when prompted by a very specific signal that has been demonstrated under oath. "So, I'll ask again, why you think he's barking at you?" Drexler hesitated, then opened his mouth, but before he could speak, a new voice cut through the quiet, measured, but laced with quiet fire. It came from the plaintiff's table. "May I address the court?" Amara's mother stood, not trembling this time, but grounded. The judge motioned for her to proceed. The woman lifted a small flash drive from her purse, holding it between 2 fingers. "This wasn't part of our original evidence submission. I was afraid to use it, afraid it wouldn't be enough, afraid it would be ignored like everything else. But Zion just told me it's time." Her words were calm, but her eyes glistened. She walked to the bailiff, handed him the drive, and said, "Please play track 2. The bailiff inserted the drive into the courtroom audio console, clicked twice, and then the speakers came alive, not with static or silence, but with something far worse. A child sobbing, gasping, staggered breathing punctuated by the unmistakable sound of bare feet shifting frantically on wood floorboards. Then came Zion's voice, not a bark, but a low, steady whimper that rose into a desperate growl. Not of offense, but of defense. The next sound was sharp. A heavy bootstep. Then, shut up, damn dog, I said shut up. The voice was unmistakable, recorded, raw and vile. It was Amara's father. The room froze in a horror more profound than any drawing could convey. Judge Holloway's hand gripped the armrest of her bench as though anchoring herself to the wood. The courtroom had gone silent in a different way now. Not stunned, not uncertain, but horrified. Zion didn't move. He didn't need to. His stance had said enough. The sound system clicked off, and the silence that followed was louder than any noise that had preceded it. Amara's father stood abruptly. "This is illegal. That recording, it's taken out of context. You can't even prove it was from my house." But his voice cracked at the edges, no longer confident, no longer controlled. It wavered like a man realizing the ground beneath him was not only. Judge Holloway turned to Drexler. "Mr. Drexler," she said, voice now cold as glass. "You reviewed this home. You claimed there were no signs of distress. You wrote that Amara was reacclimating well, and that the father posed no ongoing risk. Did you ever speak to the child directly?" Drexler hesitated. "She wouldn't talk," he muttered. "So I relied on the father's testimony and visual observations." The judge leaned forward, her voice a scalpel. "You relied on the man accused of abuse to confirm his own innocence. Did you corroborate anything? Did you ask the school, her therapist?" Drexler's face went pale. "No," he whispered. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Zion took a step closer to the bench, positioning himself between Amara and the two men who had betrayed her truth. The father who hurt her and the official who erased her pain. Judge Holloway took a deep breath. "This court," she said, "will be reviewing every report you filed in the last year, Mr. Drexler. Your credentials are under immediate suspension pending formal investigation." Drexler sank into his seat. The bailiff placed a hand on his shoulder, firm but silent. Amara remained still. Her hand now rested on Zion's back, small fingers buried in the thick fur near his shoulder blade. She didn't need to look at him. The touch was enough. Her mother returned to her seat, eyes never leaving her daughter. Her face a strange mosaic of anguish and quiet strength. Judge Holloway addressed the court. "I have heard, seen, and now, I've listened. What has been hidden is beginning to come to light." She turned toward the father. "You will remain in custody until a full psychological evaluation is completed and further charges reviewed." His attorney tried to interject, but the judge cut him off with a single look. "This is no longer about custody. This is about safety." A rustle passed through the gallery, part relief, part disbelief. No one clapped, no one moved. The air was too thick with the weight of what had just been revealed. Zion stepped back to Amara, lowering himself gently to the floor beside her. She looked at him. No signal, no command. But as he pressed his body against her leg, her small hand reached again into the envelope stack on her lap. There was one more left, creased and soft at the corners. She didn't hand it forward yet. Instead, she looked toward the gallery, toward a man she had never addressed before, one whose face she had avoided until now. He sat 2 rows behind Drexler. His name tag, tucked half behind a folder, read, Ron Taverley, CPS Regional Supervisor. Zion had already seen him. The stillness that followed the judge's declaration was not the kind of silence born of indecision or fear. It was a silence thick with the weight of something finally seen, finally heard. Zion had returned to Amara's side, like a shadow settling back into the shape it had always belonged to. The room, though crowded, felt suspended. No gavel strikes, no legal jargon. Just breath after breath held in awe and disbelief. And then, without prompt, without precedent, something unexpected happened. From the jury box, a woman perhaps in her late 40s, dark hair tied in a low knot, hands trembling visibly, rose to her feet. Her badge read Juror Ferguson, but her voice, when it broke through the hush, bore the strength of 1,000 silenced echoes. Your Honor, she said, voice cracking but unwavering, I know this isn't procedure, but the judge turned slowly, brows tightening. This was irregular, but the air had already cracked open beyond formality. Holloway nodded. Briefly, she said, Please. The woman pressed her palm against her chest and inhaled sharply, blinking back tears. I didn't expect this, she said. I thought I could sit here, evaluate facts, detached. But I see her, I see Amara, and I remember myself. Her hands clenched, and her words began to shake. I was 8 too, and I was told if I ever said anything no one would believe me, and no one did. A sob escaped her throat before she could stop it. But this dog Zion, he's doing what no one ever did for me. He's listening, he's proving, he's saying what she can't, and she stopped to wipe her face. I just want to say to that little girl, I hear you. We all do now. You're not alone anymore. The room held its breath again, but this time it was different. The silence wasn't dread, it was reverence. A few heads bowed. One man in the gallery removed his hat and pressed it to his chest. Amara didn't speak, didn't look up, but her fingers tightened in Zion's fur. The dog, ever still, blinked once, just once, as if acknowledging not just the words but the pain behind them. Judge Holloway's eyes shimmered, though her posture remained composed. Thank you, she said softly to the juror. That took courage, and it matters. But not everyone appreciated the moment. From the defense table, Amara's father's attorney, a tall, silver-haired man with a reputation for flipping cases with cold efficiency, stood abruptly. His tone, though polished, was barbed. Your Honor, with all due respect, this proceeding has lost objectivity. Emotional appeals from jurors and animal theatrics have no place in a court of law. He turned and gestured toward Zion with a sweeping hand. The dog is trained to respond to cues. It is entirely possible, no, likely, that he's being manipulated. That someone has taught him to respond to gestures in a way that paints a narrative. This is not justice. This is choreography. A few murmurs rose from the gallery, but he pressed on. Furthermore, I would like to enter an objection to the admissibility of the latest drawings. There's no evidence that Amara created them without suggestion. He didn't finish, because at that exact moment, Zion stood. No command, no gesture. He walked slowly but deliberately toward the defense table, each step deliberate, each movement silent as a shadow shifting through light. The attorney froze, his mouth half open, eyes darting nervously as the dog approached. The bailiff instinctively moved forward, but Judge Holloway raised a hand. Let him move. Let's see what happens. Zion reached the table, stood before the defense attorney, and tilted his head. Then he leaned in, not aggressively but with focused precision. He sniffed the edge of the man's right sleeve, then paused. He sniffed again, this time closer to the wrist. The attorney stepped back, visibly uncomfortable, tugging at the fabric. Zion let out a low, soft breath. Not quite a growl, but not neutral either. Then, with his nose, he nudged a faint smear of blue ink on the man's cuff. A smudge barely visible until now. The courtroom collectively leaned forward. Judge Holloway narrowed her gaze. What's on your sleeve, counsel? She asked. Ink, the attorney stammered. It's nothing, just from... But Zion barked once, a sharp sound directly into the moment. The judge's eyes flicked to the bailiff. Promised to let him go before he barked again. He put his gun in his handle area. When he was complete, he lifted the gun a little higher. Refuse, and I'll hold you in contempt. The attorney relented. The bailiff inspected the sleeve, then nodded, pulling a folded page from his pocket. Ma'am, he said, we have a problem. This matches the type of ink used to trace over the copy of the drawing presented last week, the one submitted by defense. Judge Holloway's face turned to granite. Are you suggesting this man altered or planted fabricated evidence? The bailiff nodded. It appears so. The judge turned slowly, eyes locking with the attorney. That's obstruction, and perjury by proxy. And you just got caught, by a dog. The gallery erupted into a low wave of gasps and shifting feet. The attorney, pale now, said nothing. Zion returned to Amara's side, the very picture of composure. He sat, breathed once, and resumed his watch. The judge turned toward Amara's father. Mr. Lewis, she said, you sat beside a man willing to fabricate evidence in your favor. Tell me, did you know? He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the floor, hands balled into fists. Zion stood again. Slowly this time he walked to the center of the room, looked at the judge and sat. Then he turned not toward Amara, not toward her father, but toward a woman seated behind the plaintiff's table. Someone unfiltered and She looked up, startled. She was young, mid-30s with a notepad and a courtroom ID badge. She worked for the county archives. Zion stared at her for 3 seconds. Then I looked to Amara. Then I looked to the table. The woman glanced down at her folder, then slowly lifted a page she hadn't meant to submit. It was a prior visitation report. Unsigned, unfiled, never delivered to the court. The header read, "Initial observations, high risk, household." Her eyes widened. She looked up at the judge, then back at Zion. "Then bring it here." Zion stayed perfectly still. Amara watched him, her hand resting softly on his neck. Her fingers tapped once, then once more. As the courtroom held its breath, the clerk carried the buried report forward and placed it reverently in front of Judge Holloway. The page, now slightly crumpled and faintly ink-stained from long-forgotten handling, bore a heading that had the weight of something once ignored. "Initial observations, high-risk household." Holloway didn't look at it right away. Instead, she looked at Zion, who had not moved since directing attention to the document's forgotten guardian. His gaze remained even, steady, unwavering. Mara's hand remained pressed to his fur, her fingers no longer trembling but firm, almost protective in return. The judge took a slow breath, picked up the report, scanned the highlighted portions, and then looked toward the young woman who had unwittingly carried it. "How did you come across this?" she asked. The woman swallowed hard and answered, "It was misfiled. I thought it was already included in the court record, but when the..." She trailed off, unable to make sense of how a canine had navigated a bureaucratic oversight. Holloway nodded once and said nothing, but her eyes held fire beneath the restraint. Then, the silence was broken not by a gavel, not by a bark, not by the shuffling of feet or papers, but by something smaller, softer, and infinitely more powerful. A voice. A child's voice. It wasn't loud. In fact, most in the room didn't register it at first, but the few who did immediately turned. Mara had spoken, her lips had parted slowly, and the words emerged like a stream lost. "Zion knows everything," she whispered, her voice dry but steady, eyes fixed on the space ahead. "Even the things I forget." It was not just a statement, it was a release. It was the first spoken truth in a world that had demanded her silence for too long. Her mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, tears immediately spilling over. Dr. Reese, standing to the side, stepped forward involuntarily, breath caught in his head slightly, as though trying to confirm with his ears what his heart already knew. The child who hadn't uttered a word in over 700 days had finally found her voice. And she didn't use it to scream or accuse or beg. She used it to name the only one who had spoken for her all along. Zion turned his head slightly, just enough to look up at her. Then he moved forward, 2 slow, graceful steps, and raised one paw, not abruptly, not theatrically, but with ceremonial grace, and placed it on the edge of the witness stand. The judge leaned forward, one brow lifted, her expression caught between awe and disbelief. "Amara," she said gently, "what is he doing now?" The little girl looked at Zion, her throat tightened, but she didn't retreat. Her voice came again, still faint, but clearer now. "He's telling me," she paused, took a breath so small it almost disappeared, "that it's time to go." Holloway's eyes flicked to Dr. Reese, who nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. No one could attack without the one knew how to preserve signatures. They practiced it. Amara never gave it before. It means she said what needed saying, and Zion knows it's done. It was as if the very rules of the courtroom had bent, not broken, but bent just enough to let something bigger pass through, something older than law and more sacred than protocol. Amara stood, not abruptly, not awkwardly. She stood like someone who had learned again how to carry her own weight. Zion stepped back as if to make space for her, his paw falling from the witness stand with quiet dignity. She looked to the judge, then toward her mother, who had risen from her seat with silent sobs flowing freely now. And still, Amara didn't move further. Instead, she turned slightly, looking not at her father, not at the jury, not at anyone specific, but at the space around her, the space where she had once disappeared. "He stayed," she said softly, voice barely audible but unmistakable. "When I was gone, when no one looked." Zion. The weight of those words was immediate and absolute. In the jury box, the woman who had spoken earlier covered her mouth again, shoulders shaking. On the defense side, Amara's father sat frozen, unable to meet her eyes. The false confidence had drained from his posture, replaced by something hollow and shrinking. His attorney sat beside him, fingers interlocked, no longer offering strategy, only silent. Judge Holloway slowly rose to her feet. "Mara," she said carefully, "would you like to return to your seat?" Mara didn't answer with words this time. She looked at Zion, made the smallest of gestures, just 2 fingers tapping her thigh, and he turned with her, walking at her side as she stepped down from the witness stand. They returned to her chair together. She sat, he sat. She placed her hand on his back and did not move. For a moment, the entire room held that tableau like a sacred painting. Child and dog, survivor and witness, together at the edge of something irreversible. And then, before the silence could break into its next shape, a sound emerged. Not from Zion, not from Amara, but from the gallery near the rear exit, where an old woman with silver braids and a coat too large for her frame had been watching in absolute stillness. She stood, cleared her throat, and in a voice both raspy and clear, said, "That child just saved herself, and the rest of us with her." Judge Holloway sat down slowly, her robe folding around her like nightfall. Her fingers hovered above the gavel, but she did not strike it. Instead, she turned to her clerk and said, "Retrieve the final copy of the custody recommendation. I will need it now." The clerk moved, but before reaching the desk he stopped, because Zion had stood again, his ears tilted not toward Amara this time, but toward the door, toward the hallway beyond the courtroom. And then, with the grace of ritual, he looked once more to the judge, then to Amara, and then took a single step forward. Amara, watching him, whispered only 2 words. Zion's gaze remained fixed on the door at the far end of the courtroom, as if he could already sense the moment shifting, the final threads pulling taut before they snapped into place. Amara sat still, her hand resting softly on his back, her eyes no longer wide with fear but focused, present, bearing the weight of the space around her like someone who had reclaimed something long denied. Judge Holloway watched them both for a long moment, saying nothing, her fingers hovering over the gavel that until now had only been used to contain chaos, not deliver justice. The clerk returned quietly with the official custody order, a single sheet inside a manila folder that looked strangely insignificant given the storm that had preceded it. The judge opened it, scanned the final lines, and then slowly removed her glasses. She folded them in her hand, placed them on the desk beside her, and took a breath as deep as it was fragile. Her voice when she spoke was steady but low. "This court finds that continued placement of the minor Amara Lewis with her father poses an ongoing risk to her emotional and physical well-being. Effective immediately, full legal and physical custody is granted to her mother." The words fell into the room like soft stones into still water, not shouted, not embellished, but undeniable. Gasps rose gently from the gallery, not dramatic, just human. Amara's mother covered her mouth with both hands, a sob escaping through her fingers as she leaned forward, sheer relief of the moment collapsing her into silent gratitude. Amara didn't move. Zion didn't move. But Judge Holloway did. Instead of reaching for the gavel, she stood slowly, ran a hand across her face, and then, with uncharacteristic tenderness, said, "Before I strike this into record, I need to say something that will not appear on any transcript." She looked directly at Zion, then down to Amara. "Zion," she said, her voice shaking at the edges, "you are the most courageous silent witness I've ever seen. You reminded this court and maybe all of us that truth doesn't always need words. Sometimes it only needs presence, and conviction, and loyalty that never flinches." Her eyes shimmered as she stepped back, took the gavel in hand, and whispered, "Thank you." The gavel never struck. Not yet, because before it could fall, Amara's father suddenly rose from his seat with a sharp movement that startled the room. "No," he said, loud enough to pierce the emotion in the air. "This is madness. You're all being manipulated by a dog and a drawing." His voice was raw now, stripped of performance. "She's a child. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's being coached." The bailiff moved quickly, stepping between him and the bench, his hand already at the ready. But Holloway didn't need the protection. Her glare was enough. "Mr. Lewis, sit down or be removed." But before he could comply or resist, something odd happened. A shift of air, a flicker of movement. A breeze from the gallery caught the edge of the tablecloth draped over the defense table. A white cloth that had lain there all morning, unnoticed, undisturbed. As if responding to the sudden burst of energy in the room, the cloth slipped, fluttering downward in slow motion, falling not from a forceful tug but from inevitability. It dropped to the ground, and with it came a folded document yellowed slightly at the edges, crumpled as though hastily stuffed away. The courtroom paused as the bailiff bent to retrieve it. He opened the page and stared, then looked to Judge Holloway, his voice tight with disbelief. "Ma'am, this is the original version of the Drexler report, the one that was supposedly lost." The judge stepped down from the bench, walked toward him and took the paper. She read. Her expression darkened. "This is the real report," she said slowly. "The one stating Amara was at risk. It was removed, altered, and replaced." Her eyes moved to the defense attorney, who was now pale as salt, hands shaking. "This was never supposed to be found," she said. "Where did it come from?" The clerk stammered. He stopped. "Amara, quiet all this time, looked at Zion. He brought it," she said. All heads turned. Judge Holloway frowned. "Excuse me?" Amara nodded, voice low but certain. "This morning, when we arrived." He sniffed under the bench and lay down. "I thought he was tired, but he had something in his mouth. He dropped it by my feet, but I didn't look." Her mother whispered, "You never said." Amara's voice didn't waver. "Because he didn't tell me yet it mattered." The courtroom fell still again. Judge Holloway walked to the witness stand and examined the floor beneath it. The space was narrow, hidden from view, but just large enough for a folded paper to be tucked beneath. She turned to Zion, who watched her not with excitement but with a calm that almost seemed knowing. "You found what no one wanted us to see," she whispered. Then she returned to the bench. "Mr. Lewis," she said, her voice sharp now, "you will be taken into custody for obstruction, and your counsel will be reported to the bar for ethics violations." She raised the custody order, signed it, and this time finally lifted the gavel. But before it struck wood, Zion stood again. He didn't bark. He didn't move toward the door. He looked up at Amara, made a low, brief exhale, and gently placed his head against her side. She looked down at him. She smiled just barely. Her mother wept openly now. The judge, hands still suspended in air, paused. "Amara," she said, "does he want something?" "Not yet." The judge hesitated. "Then what does he want?" Amara looked up and answered without delay. The sun stretched wide across the green expanse of Wilcox Park, casting golden patches over the walking trails and benches, and illuminating the faint glimmer of chalk drawings left by children along the sidewalks. It was late afternoon, the kind of late that made everything look softer, kinder, like the world itself was taking a breath. In a quiet corner beneath a sprawling maple tree, Amara sat cross-legged on a plaid blanket, her hands smudged with crayon wax, her knees dusted with crumbs of leaves and bits of red chalk. In front of her, a sketchpad lay open, its pages peppered with vibrant strokes of yellow, cobalt, and forest green, more color than she had used in months. Beside her, as still and familiar as always, Zion lay curled, his body half-shaded beneath the swaying canopy, one ear twitching every now and then at a distant sound, a stroller wheel, a bird's cry, a skateboard's echo, but otherwise content, peaceful. His black and tan coat shimmered under the light, darker now with age but no less regal. Amara didn't speak, but she hummed softly to herself, a tune not of words but of rhythm, the kind a child inventor. Every now and then she glanced down at the page and back to the horizon, where other children played, running, laughing, screaming with joy. But she didn't move to join them. She didn't need to. She was already somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere fully her own. It had been 6 months since the courtroom, 6 months since Zion had sat beside her through a storm of truths and lies and verdicts. 6 months since she had spoken aloud for the first time, not just words but memory. And in those 6 months, something within her had begun to grow, not quickly, not dramatically, but like roots beneath soil, steady and real. She was still quiet, still slow to speak, but she smiled more now, drew more, slept through most nights without waking. Her voice hadn't returned all at once, but in pieces, like soft feathers drifting back to nest after a long migration. Her mother had started calling it the rebuilding, not healing, not recovery, but the slow reassembly of all the parts that had once scattered in fear. Zion had remained at her side through it all. Of course, he had become a fixture not just in their apartment, but in the neighborhood. A kind of quiet legend. The dog who never barked without purpose. The companion who never strayed. The guardian whose eyes always seemed to know more than any man. A soft crunch of gravel drew near, and Amara glanced up. A boy about her age stood at the edge of the blanket, his red sneakers covered in dust, one hand holding a half-melted popsicle, the other hovering hesitantly in the air. He had wide, curious eyes and a smudge of chocolate near his chin. He didn't speak right away, but after a beat he asked with careful hope, "Can I pet your dog?" Amara blinked, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. She looked at him, not startled but studying, as if weighing not the request but the boy's intention. Then, slowly, a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Not wide, not fast, but real. And then, with the smallest motion, she tapped her chest once. Then again, 2 soft knocks over her heart. Zion's ears perked. He turned his head toward the boy, tilted it just slightly, then let out a quiet, warm woof, barely louder than a breath. The boy's eyes lit up. "He said yes?" he asked as if confirming magic. Amara nodded. The boy stepped forward, slowly, then crouched beside Zion and reached out. The German shepherd didn't flinch. He accepted the touch with calm grace, eyes half closed. "He'll sweep it once against the grass." The boy laughed. "He's soft. I thought he'd be scratchy like the big dogs at my uncle's." But then something changed. Her body shifted, just slightly, and from deep inside her chest a sound emerged. Not a whisper, not a sob, but a laugh, a small, surprised, bubbling laugh that caught her off guard even more than it did the boy. It wasn't loud, but it was light, pure, the kind of laugh that slips out before the world has a chance to scare it away. The boy grinned. "You laughed," he said, not with judgment but joy. "That's cool. My dog never lets strangers touch him. I think yours is cooler." Amara giggled again, this time not by accident. Her eyes sparkled. For the first time, laughter had returned, not just a smile, but Zion shifted slightly, placing his head in her lap, as if to say, "You see? You can come back to the world piece by piece." The boy stayed for a few minutes longer, chatting about his favorite snacks, a new video game, how he once tried to skateboard and fell on his face. Amara didn't say much, but she listened, and nodded, and laughed once more when he did an impression of his grumpy cat. Eventually, his mother called him from across the park, and he stood, brushing crumbs from his knees. "Bye," he said with a grin. "Your dog's awesome, and you're cool too." Amara lifted a hand, waved once. Her voice didn't follow, but her smile lingered long after he had gone. She turned back to her drawing. The page now held more than color. It had motion, joy. In the corner she had started a new figure herself, seated beside a boy and Zion between them, his tail wagging. The sun was big in the sky. Her hand hovered over the crayon box, then selected the gold one. She began to color the sun, slow, steady circles that mirrored the way Zion had always circled her pain, quietly, patiently, until it no longer held her in place. From behind her, her mother watched from a bench, not intruding, not calling her in, just watching, witnessing the return of a child to her childhood. Zion's ears twitched again, not in alert but in contentment. He exhaled through his nose, a long, satisfied breath, and adjusted himself closer to Amara. She leaned down, kissed the top of his head. Then, with no one watching, she whispered, "You're still listening, right?" Zion didn't bark. He didn't move, but his tail brushed gently once against her foot. That was enough. The courthouse no longer felt like a place of fear. Not to Amara. Not anymore. Time had passed, not fast, but enough to soften the sharp edges of memory and turn the cold echoes of testimony into something quieter. Something almost sacred. The halls, once dim and clinical, now held fragments of new purpose-restored trim along the windowsills. Fresh paint in pale blues and soft gray. Art from local students lining the corridor walls. But it was in the central chamber, Courtroom B, third floor left of the marble staircase, that something extraordinary had been preserved. Mounted behind protective glass near the witness stand was a single, framed drawing. The paper had been carefully flattened and preserved, but the raw lines of crayon remained just as Amara had once pressed them, bold strokes of color forming the image of a frightened girl, a towering man, and the black and tan shape of a dog standing in between, like a shield of fur and instinct. Beneath the drawing was a brass plaque, not ornate, not dramatic, but deliberate. It read, "Sometimes, the truth needs a tale to speak." It wasn't just a tribute, it was a declaration. Schoolchildren on courthouse tours often stopped there, some tilting their heads, some asking questions their teachers weren't prepared to answer. Most didn't know who Amara was. Fewer still knew Zion. But they felt something in the way the drawing hung, not like evidence, but like testimony carved into crayon. On certain mornings, when the light filtered just right through the courthouse skylight, it would hit the glass at an angle that made the red of Zion's vest glow faintly, like a silent reminder that the story never truly left these walls. On a spring afternoon 2 years later, inside the atrium of a community arts center, rows of folding chairs faced a small stage strung with paper lanterns and student paintings. A banner read, "Young Voices, New Light, Annual Youth Arts Grant Ceremony." Amara stood near the stage, now 12, taller, still quiet, but not withdrawn. Her curls were longer, wrapped in a soft blue scarf that her mother had stitched with gold thread. In her hands she clutched a sketchpad, not to present, not to draw, but to hold, as one might hold a talisman. Zion sat beside her, now slower in his step, his muzzle dusted with gray, but his eyes no less present. He wore around his neck a garland made from yarn and paper flowers, and atop his head, gently resting between his ears, was a small crown made from construction paper, folded and taped, colored in bright green and blue. Amara had made it herself that morning, just as she'd done every year on that day, a private ritual she never explained. The announcer on stage called her name. "Amara Lewis," he said, "recipient of this year's Rising Light Scholarship for Excellence in Visual Storytelling." Applause followed, but Amara didn't flinch. She stepped forward, calm, steady, and Zion rose with her. As they ascended the stage together, a beam of light slipped through the tall stained glass window above the atrium, hitting the crown on Zion's head and casting a fractured ray across the podium. The audience hushed, not in formality but in wonder. Amara took her place at the microphone. She looked out over the crowd, not nervously, not seeking approval, but searching for something real. When she spoke, her voice was clear, light, but full. "Used to think silence made me invisible," she said, "that not speaking meant not being seen. But then someone listened not to my words but to my drawings, to my dog, to my hands." She paused, glanced down at Zion, who sat perfectly still, facing the crowd. "This is Zion," she said, "my best friend, my translator, my memory when mine wasn't ready." She lifted her sketchpad, flipped it once, revealing a new drawing, 3 figures, a child, a dog, and a girl, walking hand in hand into a burst of color. "People once called me a victim," she continued, "but I'm not. I'm a storyteller. And he," she pointed to Zion, "is my living memory." Tears rolled down cheeks in the audience. A teacher clutched a tissue to her mouth. A judge from the back row recognized her and bowed her head slightly. The air seemed to hold its breath, not out of solemnity, but awe. Amara stepped back, gave a nod to the announcer, and walked off stage. Zion followed, his crown slightly tilted now, but still in place. Cameras clicked, flashes sparked, but Amara didn't pose. She walked through the crowd like a river moving through stone, quiet, unwavering, radiant. Her mother met her near the exit, arms open, eyes bright with pride. Marala hugged her tight, then knelt beside Zion and whispered something into his ear. No one heard it, but he wagged his tail once, just once, and that was enough. Outside, the evening had begun to settle. The wind was warm, scented with lilacs and the first hints of summer. Amara looked up at the sky, soft hues of amber streaking across blue, and held her sketchpad close to her chest. She turned to Zion, smiled, and said, "Ready?" He wagged again, stood, and they walked forward, not quickly, not urgently, but together toward whatever came next. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more cinematic tales like this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part hit you the hardest? Was it when Amara finally spoke, or when Zion found the hidden report? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment and let me know. Every voice adds meaning to the story.